Good evening, and welcome to Sleep to Lore. In this series, we journey through the vast and detailed histories of fictional universes, providing a calm and immersive story for you to relax and drift off to. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the silent, star-strewn void, to a mystery that sits at the very heart of one of science fiction's most enduring sagas. We will be exploring the story of the engineers, the enigmatic pale giants from the alien universe. These beings are the architects of our very existence, the gardeners of countless worlds, and yet they are also the masters of unimaginable destruction. Theirs is a story that spans millions of years, a story of creation, disappointment, and ultimately self-annihilation. If you enjoy these long-form explorations of lore and find them helpful for relaxing or sleeping, please consider subscribing to the channel or leaving a like on the video. It helps us to continue creating these narratives for you. Before we begin our journey into the deep past, I have a question for you to consider. The central idea of the engineers is that one advanced species could be responsible for seeding life on many different planets. My question is this: do you believe it is more likely that life in our galaxy arises independently on various worlds, or that it could indeed be the result of a single, ancient origin spreading outwards? There is no right or wrong answer, but I would be interested to read your thoughts in the comment section below. Now find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. We are going back, far back, to a time before humanity, to witness the very first act in our long and complicated story. Chapter 1. The Architects of Life, a Primordial Sacrifice. Imagine, if you will, a world without life. It is not an empty world, but it is a silent one. The only sounds are the deep, groaning shifts of tectonic plates deep beneath the surface, the hiss of superheated steam escaping from fissures in the rock, and the percussive crash of water falling from great heights. This is a young planet, a place of raw, untamed chemistry and immense geological power. The sky is not blue. It is a bruised orange, tinged with the murky grey of volcanic ash that perpetually hangs in the thin, nitrogen-heavy atmosphere. Storms of a scale we can barely comprehend rage across the continents, with lightning that spiders across the entire sky, illuminating a landscape of jagged black rock and glassy obsidian fields. There are no trees, no grass, no birdsong. There are only mountains, sharp and new, their peaks not yet worn down by the patient caress of wind and rain. Vast oceans stretch from one horizon to the other, but they are not the vibrant blue seas we know. They are a dull, chemical green, a primordial soup, rich with the building blocks of something yet to come. They are warm, heated from below by volcanic vents that spew minerals and gas into the deep, creating a chaotic environment of extreme temperatures and pressures. This world is a laboratory, perfectly prepared, its beakers and vials filled with all the necessary ingredients, but it is waiting for a catalyst. It is waiting for a spark. It is a canvas that has been stretched and primed, waiting for the first stroke of the artist's brush. For eons it has waited in this state of suspended potential, a silent symphony with no conductor to begin the first note. Into this profound silence, something new arrives. It does not tear through the atmosphere with fire and fury. It does not announce its presence with a sonic boom or the roar of engines. It simply appears, a shadow passing over the harsh landscape. At first, it might be mistaken for a cloud, but its shape is too perfect, its edges too defined. It is a craft, vast and dark, shaped like a crescent or a curved blade. Its surface is not metallic in a way we would recognize. It seems to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it, a matty, biomechanical texture that feels more grown than built. This is a juggernaut, a ship of the beings we have come to call the engineers. It moves with an impossible grace, a testament to a technology so advanced It is indistinguishable from nature itself. It glides through the thick, ashen air without disturbing it, a phantom moving through a sleeping world. The craft descends towards a region of immense natural power, a place where a continent-sized waterfall crashes down from a high plateau into a churning, misty river below. The sheer force of the water is a display of the planet's raw energy. The juggernaut comes to a rest on a wide, flat precipice near the edge of this colossal cascade. For a long time, nothing happens. The ship sits in silence, an impossible object in a primordial landscape, a single, deliberate thought in a world that does not yet know how to think. Then a ramp descends. It lowers not with mechanical whirring, but with a quiet, organic unfolding, like a petal opening. From the dark interior of the ship, a figure emerges. It is colossal, standing over 2 meters tall, its form a perfect example of humanoid evolution taken to its absolute apex. Its skin is a luminous pale white like polished marble, and it is devoid of hair. Its musculature is perfectly defined, not with the bulky mass of a brute, but with the lean, efficient power of a deity from an ancient myth. This being is an engineer. It wears a simple, dark grey robe, a humble garment for a creature of such magnificence. Its face is classical, almost Grecian in its features, with a strong jaw and a straight nose. But it is the eyes that hold the true weight of its existence. They are dark, completely black, and they seem to hold a depth that is both intelligent and ancient. There is no readable emotion in them, not pride, not fear, not joy. There is only a profound and unshakable sense of purpose. This being has come here to perform a sacred and final task. The engineer walks slowly, deliberately, towards the edge of the waterfall. In its hands, it carries a small, ornate container. It is a simple object, yet it hums with the same advanced, otherworldly design as the ship. The being stops at the very edge of the cliff, the thundering roar of the water filling the air around it, the cold spray misting its pale skin. It looks out over the lifeless world, a world it is about to change forever. Is this a moment of reflection, a final prayer? We can only speculate. Perhaps it is contemplating the infinite complexity of what is about to happen, the billions upon billions of lives that will spring from its single, final act. Or perhaps for a being this ancient, this is simply a process, a duty to be fulfilled, a mechanism of the universe in which it is a willing and vital cog. With a quiet reverence, the engineer opens the small container. Inside is a thick, dark liquid, almost black, bubbling slowly with a strange internal energy. It looks like a living thing, a contained piece of chaos. The container is a cup, and the engineer raises it to its lips. There is no hesitation. It consumes the dark liquid in one deliberate swallow. For a moment it stands perfectly still, its dark eyes looking up at the orange sky. Then the process begins. It is not a gentle transformation. It is a violent, catastrophic dissolution. The engineer's body begins to break down at a cellular level. Its pale skin darkens and cracks like drying riverbed clay. Veins of blackness spread across its form as the potent accelerant it has consumed courses through its body, rewriting its very essence. The being stumbles, its immense strength failing it. It falls to its knees, its body convulsing as it is unmade from the inside out. This is not death as we understand it. It is a deconstruction, a sacrifice. The engineer's form begins to disintegrate, its cells rupturing, its structure collapsing. The perfect statuesque body dissolves into a cascade of genetic material, a torrent of information. With its last ounce of will, it tumbles over the edge of the cliff, falling into the raging waters below. As its body hits the water, it completely and utterly dissolves. it does not leave a corpse. It becomes a cloud of pure DNA, the fundamental building blocks of life, which are carried away by the powerful current. Its genetic code, a code refined over countless eons of evolution, unspools and spreads throughout the river. This river feeds into the great sterile oceans of the planet, and in those oceans the catalyst has finally been introduced. The spark has been lit. The engineer's DNA, rich and complex beyond measure, begins to interact with the planet's native chemistry. It finds purchase, bonding with amino acids, forming the first simple proteins. The first single-celled organisms begin to form, kick-started by this immense infusion of alien biology. Life has begun. From the sacrifice of one, billions will eventually emerge. The act is complete. The ship, its purpose fulfilled, rises silently from the clifftop and ascends back into the orange sky, disappearing as quietly as it arrived. It leaves behind a world that is no longer silent, for it is now filled with the quiet, inexorable hum of nascent life. But this act, this primordial sacrifice, raises the most profound question of all. Why? What could possibly motivate a species of such advanced power to perform such an act, not just once, but as we later learn, on countless worlds across the galaxy? The answer is not simple, and it likely lies in a philosophy so alien that we can only grasp at its edges. One possibility is that the engineers are, at their core, scientists. They may view the universe as a grand cosmic laboratory. They understand the principles of abiogenesis, the process by which life arises from non-living matter, but perhaps they see it as an inefficient, astronomically rare event. They are gardeners in a vast, empty garden. They do not wait for seeds to be carried on the wind, they plant them themselves. For them, a world like the one we witnessed, a world with the potential for life but lacking the final spark, is an unacceptable waste. Their sacrifice is then a scientific imperative, an act of seeding a petri dish on a planetary scale to observe what grows. They are not gods in a religious sense, but cosmic biologists conducting the ultimate experiment over and over again, simply to see the results, to gather data, to further their understanding of existence itself. Another perhaps more compelling theory is that the engineers are artists. They do not see a sterile planet as a failed experiment, but as a blank canvas. Life, in all its chaotic, beautiful and terrifying forms, is their medium. The sacrifice is the first, bold stroke of paint, the evolution of species, the rise of civilizations, the grand, unfolding drama of existence is the masterpiece they are creating. They are not interested in data or results in a scientific sense. They are interested in aesthetics, in the story that will unfold. The sheer diversity of life that will emerge from their single genetic blueprint is a testament to their artistry. They do not dictate what the painting will become. They merely set the conditions for it to paint itself. They are the ultimate patrons of the arts, funding the creation of entire biospheres with their own bodies. Then there is the possibility of a spiritual or religious motivation. Perhaps the engineers are not acting on their own behalf, but are serving a higher power or a sacred doctrine. Their entire civilization could be built around a belief that life is a sacred gift that must be shared. They may believe that they were the first, or among the first, to achieve consciousness in the galaxy. And with that awareness comes a profound responsibility. The universe, in their view, is meant to be filled with life, with thought, with experience. A silent, empty cosmos is a perversion, a flaw that must be corrected. Their sacrificial ritual is therefore not a choice, but a sacred duty, sacrament performed to honor their gods or to fulfill a cosmic destiny. The engineer who gives its life is not a victim, but a martyr, a saint who ensures the great chain of being continues. Its death is the highest form of worship. Or perhaps the motivation is something far simpler, something we can understand on a more fundamental level, a biological imperative. Just as the simplest organisms are driven to replicate, perhaps the engineers as a civilization are driven by a similar, albeit far more complex, instinct. They may have reached the apex of their own evolution, a state of biological perfection, and the only remaining drive is to propagate the essence of what they are. Not by creating more of themselves, but by creating new and different forms of life based on their fundamental code. Their civilization might not expand through conquest or colonization in the way we would, but through this act of genetic seeding. Their empire is not one of planets, but of biospheres. Their legacy is not written in stone monuments, but in the DNA of every living thing on 1,000 different worlds. Whatever the true reason, the result is the same. The act of creation is complete. But the engineer's work is not finished with this single dramatic act. They are not the kind of gods who create a world and then abandon it to its fate. They are gardeners, and a gardener tends to their garden. Millennia upon millennia pass. The single cells that were born from the engineer's sacrifice multiply, evolve, and diversify. They become complex organisms. They colonize the oceans, and then, tentatively, they crawl onto the land. Plants begin to reach for the dim sun, turning the black continents green. Animals evolve to fill every possible niche. The process is slow, patient, and guided by the brutal but effective hand of natural selection. And through it all, the engineers watch. Their visits are rare and subtle. They do not land in great cities and announce themselves as creators. They do not hand down laws or technologies. Their guidance is far more enigmatic, more like a dream or a half-remembered myth. They observe the slow, stumbling progress of their creations. On our world, they watch as a species of clever primates begins to master its environment. They see the first tools, the first fires, the first communities. They watch the birth of humanity. Perhaps they see something special in us, a spark of curiosity, a capacity for abstraction, a drive to understand the very universe we inhabit, or perhaps we are simply one of their more promising projects among many scattered across the stars. During this period, they choose to interact, but only in the most limited and cryptic way. Imagine a small tribe of early humans huddled in a cave for shelter. A juggernaut ship descends from the sky, silent and immense. A single, pale engineer emerges. It does not speak, for our language is primitive and irrelevant. It does not make threats or promises. It simply stands before the awe-struck, terrified humans, a living God descended from the heavens. It is a teacher, but its lesson is a silent one. It points a long, elegant finger up at the night sky, towards a particular constellation, a specific cluster of stars. It holds the gesture, ensuring the image is burned into the minds of the creatures before it. Then, as silently as it came, it departs. The humans left behind try to make sense of this divine encounter. They cannot comprehend the technology or the biology of their visitor, but they understand the gesture. It was a message, a sacred sign, and so they recreate it in the only way they know how. On the walls of their caves, using charcoal and ochre pigments, they paint the image of the tall, pale giant, and they paint the pattern of stars it showed them. This event is not unique. It is repeated across the globe over thousands of years, with cultures that have no possible way of communicating with each other. The ancient Mayans in the jungles of Central America, the Sumerians in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, the Egyptians along the banks of the Nile, the people of ancient Hawaii. All of them, separated by vast oceans and insurmountable spans of time, create artifacts and drawings that depict the same thing, giant, godlike beings, and an identical map of the stars, a map that points to a distant solar system with a specific planet and its moons highlighted. For centuries, we would look at these artifacts as curiosities, the strange, recurring motifs of primitive religions. But they are not just myths, they are a signature. They are the mark of the artist left on the canvas. The engineers were not just seeding life, they were branding their work. They were leaving behind a clue to their own origin, a map that said, "We were here, we made you." But the interpretation of this map by humanity would become a crucial and perhaps fatal misunderstanding. For us, a map is an invitation. It is a set of directions that says, "Come and find us." We saw the star map as a welcoming gesture from our creators, a call to journey across the stars and meet them, to ask them the great questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose? But it is highly likely that this was never the engineer's intention. A painter who signs their work in the corner of the canvas does not necessarily want the admirer to come to their home and knock on their door. The signature is simply a statement of authorship. The star map may have been nothing more than that, a final cryptic piece of guidance, a reminder to their children that they were not an accident, that they were part of a larger galactic design. During this long golden era, the relationship between creator and creation, though distant, seems to be one of benevolent observation. The engineers are content to watch their garden grow. They see humanity develop agriculture, build cities, create art, and formulate philosophies. Our progress for a time must have been a source of pride for them. The experiment was a success. The artwork was taking on a beautiful and complex form. They were gods, and for a while they were good gods. They had filled a silent corner of the universe with the vibrant noise of a burgeoning civilization. They had succeeded in their grand cosmic purpose. From their distant vantage point, they watched as their children took their first stumbling steps, full of potential, full of promise. They could not have known, or perhaps they chose to ignore, the darkness that was also growing within their creation. A capacity for violence, for betrayal, and for self-destruction that would one day lead these benevolent gardeners to turn on their own garden and seek to burn it down to the very last root. Their role as architects of life was nearing its end, and a new, terrible chapter was about to begin, one in which they would take up the mantle of architects of death. But for now, in the deep past, there is only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a universe made richer by their sacrifice. Chapter 2. The Architects of Death, the Fall from Grace. The long arc of creation is a patient one. For millennia beyond human comprehension, the cosmic gardeners we call the engineers tended to their works. They watched from an unimaginable distance as the seeds of their own sacrifice blossomed into vibrant, chaotic biospheres. On our own world, they observed the rise of humanity, a species that carried their essential genetic blueprint, a species that possessed a spark of intelligence and curiosity that must have, for a time, filled them with a profound sense of accomplishment. The star maps they left behind were a signature, a quiet acknowledgement of their paternity. It was a golden age, a time of silent, benevolent observation. But a garden, no matter how carefully planted, can grow weeds. And in their eyes, humanity was becoming a weed of the most virulent and dangerous kind. The architects of life were about to change their profession. The shift was not sudden. It was not a single decision made in a moment of anger. It was a slow, dawning horror, a disappointment that curdled over thousands of years into a cold and final judgment. From their vantage point, the engineers had a perspective on our history that we could never possess. They saw it not as a series of distinct events, but as a single, unfolding pattern of behavior. In our infancy, our tribal conflicts and primitive struggles were perhaps seen as the natural growing pains of a young species, the scuffles of children in a sandbox. But as our intelligence grew, so too did our capacity for cruelty. The scale of our violence became something monstrous. They watched as we built the first great empires, not on foundations of cooperation and enlightenment, but on the backs of slaves, They saw our ingenuity, the same spark they had nurtured, being turned not towards the betterment of our species, but towards the perfection of warfare. We learned to forge bronze, and we immediately fashioned it into swords and spearheads. We mastered iron, and we built machines of siege and conquest. Every technological leap forward was almost instantly matched and often surpassed by an innovation in the art of killing one another. They saw civilizations rise, create wonders, and then be utterly annihilated by their neighbors in orgies of violence. They saw libraries of knowledge put to the torch, cities razed to the ground, and entire cultures erased from existence over disputes of land or pride or faith. From the cosmic silence where they observed, the ceaseless noise of our world must have been a cacophony of pain and rage. They were a species that had achieved a perfect harmony, a oneness of purpose that allowed them to manipulate the very fabric of life itself. They saw the universe as a place of order, of design, of potential to be unlocked, and they looked at their creation, humanity, and they saw only chaos. They saw a species hopelessly, perhaps genetically, addicted to self-destruction. We were a failed experiment. We were the beautiful, intricate clock that a master craftsman had built, which for some unknown reason insisted on smashing its own gears. This growing disappointment likely came to a head in a single, catastrophic event. The details are lost to us, buried under 2,000 years of mythology and misinterpretation, but the theory is a powerful one. It is believed that at a critical juncture in our history, the engineers decided to intervene more directly. Their subtle guidance and distant observation had not been enough. We were on a path to ruin, and perhaps, in a final act of parental responsibility, they sent one of their own to try and set us straight. Imagine the arrival of this emissary. It would not have been a conquest. A single juggernaut ship would have descended from the heavens, and from it would have emerged a single engineer. It would have come to us not as a warrior, but as a teacher. It would have possessed knowledge that could have transformed our world, ended our diseases, solved our conflicts, and guided us toward a future as a peaceful, enlightened species worthy of our creators. It may have lived among us, spoken to us, and tried to steer our violent impulses toward a more constructive path. But we, in our fear and our ignorance, would not have seen a savior. We would have seen a threat. Humanity has never reacted well to that which it does not understand. Power, especially power that we do not possess ourselves, inspires not awe, but jealousy and fear. The teachings of this being would have been twisted and corrupted. Its abilities would have been seen as dangerous magic. The leaders and priests of the time would have seen it as a challenge to their authority. They would have rallied the fearful masses against this outsider, this alien who dared to tell us that our ways were wrong. The betrayal was as inevitable as it was tragic. They seized this being, this gift from the stars, this final hope for our salvation, and they subjected it to the ultimate act of human barbarism. They tortured it, and then they killed it. The crucifixion of the engineer emissary, if this account is true, was the moment the door was slammed shut. It was the final, unforgivable sin. We had not just disobeyed our creators, we had murdered their messenger in the most cruel and degrading way imaginable. We had taken their offer of peace and spat it back in their faces. For the engineers, this act would have been the final piece of evidence. There was no redeeming humanity. The experiment was not just a failure, it was a contagion. We were a plague upon the beautiful world they had so carefully cultivated. The decision was made. The garden had to be sterilized. The canvas had to be wiped clean. The architects of life now had a new and terrible purpose: to design our complete and utter extinction. This was not a task to be undertaken lightly or with simple tools. The engineers did not deal in conventional weapons. Their methods, like their creations, were biological. To erase a species of their own making, they required a substance of equally profound power, and for this, they turned to a place far from the light of our sun, a desolate moon orbiting a gas giant in the Zeta Reticuli system, a place we would come to know as LV-223. LV-223 was not a home, it was not a colony, it was a forge. It was a weapons development facility of a scope and purpose that dwarfs any military installation in human history. The moon itself is a harsh, unwelcoming place, perpetually shrouded in roiling clouds of silica storms. The surface is a jagged, mountainous terrain of grey rock, whipped by winds that can strip flesh from bone. It is a world that seems actively hostile to life, which made it the perfect isolated laboratory for the engineers' dark work. Here they constructed a series of immense pyramid-like structures, great mounds that rose from the desolate landscape. These were not built from quarried stone or forged metal. They seemed to be of the same biomechanical material as their ships, as if they had been grown rather than assembled. The surface of these structures was covered in geometric patterns and channels, giving them the appearance of giant, alien circuit boards laid over the land. The purpose was clear. This was a place of industry, of function, a place of grim, methodical work. There was no art here, no beauty. There was only the cold, hard architecture of annihilation. The mission was to take the very agent of their creation and pervert it into an agent of destruction. The dark, life-giving liquid that had been used to seed our world was a form of programmable matter, an accelerant that broke down and reformed DNA according to a specific purpose. The substance used in the primordial sacrifice was the purest form, designed to deconstruct a single, complex organism and create billions of simple ones. Now, on LV-223, their goal was to reverse the process. They needed to engineer a version of this substance that would not create, but corrupt. A version that would take life and twist it into something monstrous and unrecognizable before violently extinguishing it. They sought to create the ultimate biological weapon. Inside the Great Pyramid structures of LV-223, the environment was even more alien. The corridors were vast and cavernous, with the same biomechanical texture as the exterior. The air was thick, breathable but heavy with an unnatural stillness. The entire facility felt like a tomb, a place that had been sealed for an eternity. The engineers moved through these halls with a new, grim purpose. They were no longer the benevolent gardeners of the cosmos. They were soldiers and scientists engaged in a holy war against their own children. At the heart of one of these structures lay a vast, temple-like chamber. The acoustics were perfect, amplifying every footstep into an echoing report. In the center of this chamber stood a monolithic sculpture, a colossal head of an engineer, its face serene and its dark eyes staring blankly into the darkness. This may have been a monument to their own form, a reminder of the perfection they were about to unleash upon our imperfection. Or perhaps it was a place of worship, a focal point where they meditated on the terrible necessity of their work. This sacred space, which in a different time might have been used for rituals of creation, was now the main laboratory for their weapon. Arranged in precise ritualistic patterns on the floor of this chamber were hundreds upon hundreds of stone-like urns. These vessels were elegantly crafted, almost like funeral urns, their surfaces covered in intricate cuneiform-like markings. They looked like objects of religious significance, and in a way they were. They were the containers for their new faith, the faith of total eradication. Inside each of these urns was a quantity of the weaponized black liquid, their perfected pathogen. This new substance was a terrifying perversion of its life-giving counterpart. Where the original substance broke down life to create a new, this version attacked it with a ravenous, aggressive hunger. It was designed to act as a mutagenic accelerant of terrifying potency. Upon contact with a living organism, It would invade the host at a cellular level, forcing its DNA to rewrite itself at an explosive rate. It did not simply kill, it transformed. It caused uncontrolled cancerous growth, hideous mutations. It turned flesh into something alien and nightmarish. An organism exposed to it would see its own body betray it, its form twisting and contorting into a weaponized parody of itself before it finally, violently expired. The engineers, in their cold, scientific pursuit of our destruction, tested this substance extensively. The evidence of their work was etched into the very walls of their facility. Murals carved in relief decorated the chambers. These were not the hopeful images of gods visiting primitive man. These were biological horror stories. They depicted the pathogen's effect on various life forms, and more chillingly, they depicted what appeared to be the ultimate goal of their research. Among the images of mutation and death was the recurring image of a creature that would one day become humanity's greatest nightmare. A biomechanical predator with a long phallic head, a secondary jaw, and a body of pure, weaponized biology. The xenomorph. It seems the engineer's plan was not simply to poison our world. That would be too simple, too clean. Their judgment was to be more poetic, more terrible. They were not just creating a virus, they were attempting to engineer a perfect organism, a predator designed for the sole purpose of hunting and killing. They wanted to create a wolf to unleash upon their sheep. This creature, born from the black goo's interaction with other life forms, would be the instrument of our extinction. It would be a relentless, unstoppable force of nature that would sweep across our planet, and we would be utterly helpless before it. We, the flawed creation, would be purged by a new creation, a perfect engine of death. It was a plan of truly biblical, apocalyptic scope. They refined the pathogen for years, or perhaps centuries. They perfected its delivery system, storing it within the urns which were designed to activate and disperse their contents when the atmospheric conditions were right, such as when they were exposed to the air of a planet like Earth. The work was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. Finally, the time came. The pathogen was stable, the delivery vessels were prepared. The great juggernaut ships in the hangars of LV-223 were being loaded with their deadly cargo. The flight plans were being programmed with a single, final destination: Earth. The day of judgment was at hand. The fleet was preparing to depart on its mission of righteous genocide. But the universe has a way of inflicting a terrible and poetic irony upon those who display such monumental hubris. The engineers, in their quest to create the perfect weapon to destroy us, had failed to account for one critical variable: the weapon's own indiscriminate, chaotic nature. They believed they had contained it, that they could control it. They were wrong. What happened next is a story told not in words, but in the ghostly echoes left behind in the facility's holographic records. There was an accident, a containment breach. Perhaps a single urn was dropped, or a seal failed. Maybe one of the scientists became infected through a moment of carelessness. The exact cause is irrelevant. The result was absolute catastrophe. The very weapon they had perfected to use against humanity was unleashed upon them inside the sealed environment of their own facility. The black goo did not care that its victims were its creators. It did its work as it was designed to do. The pathogen spread through the outpost with terrifying speed. The holographic recordings, when viewed millennia later, show a scene of utter panic. They depict the engineers, these calm, godlike beings, running for their lives down the dark corridors of their own creation. They are not fighting. They are fleeing from a threat they cannot possibly contain. They are being hunted, their bodies mutating and turning on one another. The order and purpose of the facility dissolved into a screaming, violent chaos. The architects of death became the first victims of their own design. The outbreak was swift and total. The pathogen killed them, but not before it used them. Some were dissolved by its acidic properties, others had their bodies explode as their cells underwent runaway mutation, and some became hosts for something new. The murals on the wall were not just plans, they were a prophecy. The pathogen, interacting with the unique biology of its engineer hosts, created new and terrifying forms of life, monstrous creatures that rampaged through the facility, ensuring that no one would escape. The Great Forge of LV-223 became a slaughterhouse, and then a graveyard. The Masters of Life had engineered their own extinction on this remote, forgotten moon. But not all of them perished. Amidst the chaos, one engineer managed to make it to safety. We see him in the final holographic log, a lone figure, running desperately for one of the Juggernaut ships in the hangar bay. He is clutching his side, perhaps already infected, or perhaps just wounded in the chaos. He reaches the ramp of his ship just as the great hangar door is closing, crushing one of his comrades who was just moments behind him. He seals the inner door, cutting off the sounds of the massacre outside. He is alone, he is a survivor, but he is also a soldier, and his mission has not been forgotten. Inside the cockpit of his Juggernaut, surrounded by a full cargo of the deadly urns, he initiates the pre-flight sequence. The destination is still locked in, Earth. His purpose is unchanged. He intends to complete the mission, to deliver the judgment that his civilization had decreed. But something is wrong. Perhaps he is succumbing to the pathogen, or perhaps the facility's life support systems are failing. He knows he cannot complete the journey in his current state. And so he makes his way to the hypersleep chamber, a sterile pod designed for long-duration interstellar travel. He lies down in the chamber, the last living being in this monument to hubris. The pod seals, and a cocktail of gases fills the chamber, putting him into a state of suspended animation. His last thought is of his mission, the sacred duty to cleanse the galaxy of their greatest failure. He falls into a deep, dreamless sleep, a loaded weapon with a sleeping pilot, waiting for someone to come and press the trigger. For 2,000 years he would sleep, while the civilization that sent him would crumble to dust elsewhere in the galaxy. He slept, a solitary ghost in a tomb of his own making, a final dormant instrument of a wrath that had long since consumed itself. The architect of death was now only a sleeping echo, waiting to be woken. Chapter 3. The architects of their own demise, an echo of extinction. For 2,000 years the Juggernaut ship lay silent within the cold, dark hangar of the facility on LV-223. It was a tomb within a tomb. Outside its hull, the pyramid structure was a mausoleum to a forgotten catastrophe, haunted by the ghostly, holographic echoes of its creator's final moments. Inside the ship, in a sterile hypersleep chamber, the last soldier of a dead empire slept a dreamless sleep. His body was held in perfect stasis, his biological functions suspended on the edge of life, his mind a quiet, empty vessel. His mission, a vendetta 2 millennia old, was frozen in time with him. The cargo he carried, an arsenal of biological apocalypse, waited patiently in the dark. The universe continued its slow, indifferent dance. Stars were born and died. On the distant world of Earth, empires rose and fell. Humanity built new gods, new weapons, and new dreams. And all the while, the sleeping engineer waited. He was a loaded gun with a rusted trigger, a final, terrible sentence, waiting for a reader who would never come. Or so it seemed. The silence was finally broken, not by an internal command or a celestial event, but by a rude and unwelcome intrusion. A new sound echoed in the ancient hangar, the sound of machinery, not of engineer design. It was the hum of human technology. A group of explorers, a species the sleeper was meant to destroy, had crossed an impossible gulf of space, guided by the ancient star maps that were intended not as an invitation, but as a signature. They had come seeking their makers, their gods. They had found only a tomb. And now, driven by a foolish and fatal curiosity, they had found their way to his ship. Their clumsy hands worked at the ship's external controls. They forced open the great ramp, violating the sanctity of the sealed vessel. They stepped inside, their helmet lights cutting sharp, unwelcome beams through the still, dark air. Their voices, tinny and distorted through their communication systems, were a profane chatter in a place of deep silence. They activated a holographic display, replaying the final, desperate moments of his long-dead comrades. They saw the terror, but they did not understand the warning. They saw the destination programmed into the ship's navigation system, their own home world. And they finally understood the facility was not a place of creation, but a place of war. Their meddling sent a cascade of commands through the ship's ancient, dormant systems. Power surged through conduits that had been cold for centuries. The ship's internal environment began to stabilize, and in the cockpit, a signal was sent to the hypersleep chamber. The process of reanimation had begun. The trigger had been pulled. Inside the pod, the awakening was a slow, gentle violence. The first sensation was the hiss of gas as the stasis compounds were purged from the chamber. Then came the cold, a deep, penetrating chill as the pod's temperature slowly rose to a life-sustaining level. A low hum vibrated through the gel-like substance that cushioned his body. Electrical impulses, small at first, then stronger, stimulated his nerve endings, forcing his muscles to twitch and contract, chasing away the long atrophy of his slumber. His first thought was not a thought at all, but a deep, primal instinct, a sense of profound wrongness. The sleep was not supposed to end this way. It was meant to end upon arrival in orbit over the target world, not here, in the cold, dead hangar of LV-223. Consciousness returned in fragmented pieces. He remembered the chaos, the alarms, the screaming. He remembered the desperate run for the ship, the sight of his comrade being crushed by the closing door. He remembered his mission, the righteous, cleansing fire he was tasked to deliver to the flawed, violent creatures that had betrayed their creators. The memory was as clear and as potent as it had been the moment he closed his eyes 2,000 years ago. His purpose, his entire reason for being, came flooding back into his mind. The pod opened with a sigh of pressurized air. The engineer sat up, his movements stiff but powerful. He was a giant, a being of marble and might, his pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned the chamber, taking in every detail. The ship was active. The intruders were here. He could feel their presence, a contamination in the pure, sterile environment of his vessel. He stood, his full height nearly touching the curved ceiling of the cockpit. He saw them then, huddled behind the holographic navigation display. These were the creatures from the world designated Earth. They were so small, so fragile, wrapped in their clumsy, bulky suits. They stared at him with an expression he recognized, though he had not seen it for millennia, the awe of a primitive creature in the presence of its god. But he was not their god. He was their judgment. He was their end. One of them, a synthetic, a machine built in their image, dared to speak. It uttered a string of sounds in a harsh, guttural approximation of his own ancient language. The words were a perversion, a child mimicking the speech of its parent without any comprehension of the meaning. The synthetic spoke of a desire for more life, a pathetic plea from its creator, a dying old man who had traveled across the stars to beg for a few more years of existence from the very beings who had condemned his entire species to death. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The ignorance was absolute. The engineer listened, his expression unreadable. He looked at the synthetic, then at the humans cowering behind it. He saw in them everything that had led to the Great Judgment. He saw their arrogance, believing they could stride into the home of a god and make demands. He saw their weakness, their reliance on technology and machines to survive in environments their frail bodies could not endure. He saw the ultimate evidence of their blasphemy in the form of the synthetic. They had not only failed to live up to their own potential, they had begun to create artificial life of their own, a pathetic imitation of the engineer's sacred work. They were a cancer, and they were beginning to metastasize. His rage was not a hot, explosive thing. It was cold, deep, and ancient. It was the righteous fury of a creator looking upon a failed creation. It was the disgust of a gardener finding a beautiful plant has become twisted and diseased. There was no need for words, no room for negotiation. There was only the mission. He reached out, not in greeting but in violence. He grabbed the head of the synthetic, the talking machine, and with a single, contemptuous motion, he tore it from its body. The act was effortless, like a man tearing a page from a book. The humans reacted with predictable panic. They scrambled, they shouted, their weapons discharged uselessly against the architecture of the ship. The engineer moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. He was not just a scientist or a gardener, he was a warrior, a being whose physical form was a weapon in itself. He backhanded one of the humans, the force of the blow crushing the man's helmet and sending his body flying across the cockpit like a discarded doll. He grabbed another, lifting him into the air by his head, and slammed his body repeatedly against the hypersleep pod, the impacts punctuated by the crunch of bone and the failure of life support systems. In a matter of seconds, the intruders were dead, all but one. A single human female had managed to escape the cockpit during the chaos. He could sense her, a fleeting, panicked presence somewhere in the corridors of his ship. She was an irrelevance, a loose end to be dealt with later. His priority was the mission. He moved to the ship's control interface. The biomechanical chair rose from the floor to meet him. He sat, and the ship seemed to become an extension of his own body. The controls, a series of strange flutes and holographic displays, came to life under his touch. He activated the ship's systems, preparing it for launch. The great hangar doors began to grind open, revealing the stormy, desolate landscape of LV-223. The time for judgment was finally at hand, 2,000 years delayed, but no less inevitable. As he prepared for takeoff, the escaped human female did something unexpected. She had reached a vehicle outside the ship and was desperately trying to communicate with him, or rather, with the ship that had brought her here. She was warning them. She was telling them to stop him at all costs, to prevent his ship from leaving the moon. It was a futile gesture, the last desperate act of a doomed species. What could their primitive vessel possibly do to his own? Then the unthinkable happened. The human ship, the Prometheus, turned and accelerated directly towards his own juggernaut on a collision course. It was a suicidal act, an act of such self-destructive defiance that it perfectly encapsulated everything the engineers had come to despise about humanity. They would rather destroy themselves and their own ship than allow their judgment to be delivered. The engineer watched on his screen as the vessel grew larger, its intent undeniable. He tried to take evasive action to lift his ship out of the path of the collision, but it was too late. The Juggernaut was a massive craft, not designed for nimble maneuvers within a confined space. The impact was catastrophic. The human ship, though smaller, slammed into the Juggernaut with the force of a small asteroid. Metal screamed and tore. The ancient biomechanical hull of the engineer's ship, which had withstood the vacuum of space for millennia, was breached and broken. The two ships became a single, tangled mass of wreckage. The Juggernaut, its systems failing, its structural integrity compromised, began a long, terrible fall back to the surface of the moon. It crashed into the grey dust with an earth-shattering impact, rolling and tumbling across the landscape, shedding debris until it finally came to rest, a broken crescent, a dead machine. The engineer survived the crash. He was wounded, his body bruised and cut, but his superior physiology held together. He emerged from the wreckage of his cockpit, his cold fury now mixed with a sense of disbelief. His ship was destroyed, his cargo of death was scattered and broken, his mission, his sacred 2,000-year-old duty, had been thwarted by the very insects he was meant to exterminate. He saw the escape pod from the human ship nearby. The female was still alive, his purpose narrowed to a single, final act of vengeance. He would extinguish this last, defiant spark of humanity. He stormed towards the lifeboat, his immense form silhouetted against the stormy sky. He tore the door from its hinges and entered, his dark eyes scanning for his prey. But he found something else waiting for him. During the chaos on his ship, the human female had been infected by her own partner, who had himself been exposed to a small amount of the black goo. She had been carrying an alien parasite within her, a creature she had surgically removed in a desperate act of self-preservation. That creature had grown, festered, and mutated in the medical bay of the lifeboat. And it was now a monster. A huge, pale, squid-like creature with a multitude of grasping tentacles. It lunged at the engineer, a living embodiment of his own weaponized biology. He, a being who could tear a man apart with his bare hands, was now locked in a desperate struggle with a nightmare born from his own science. The creature was immensely powerful, its tentacles wrapping around his limbs and torso, its strength a match for his own. He was caught, overwhelmed. The creature forced him to the ground, its body covering his own. A fleshy tube extended from its maw and forced its way down his throat, planting a seed deep within his chest. The creator was being violated, impregnated by a perversion of his own creation. The struggle was brief and final. The engineer went still, his body limp under the weight of the monster. His purpose, his mission, his very life had ended here, on this desolate rock. Not in a blaze of righteous glory, but in a squalid, ironic horror. He had become a host, a womb for his own damnation. His body lay there for a time, inert. Then a tremor ran through his chest, his ribs cracked and broke from within. A small, pointed head, slick with blood, burst through his sternum. It was a new creature, a new form of life, born from the triple helix of engineered DNA, human DNA, and the mutagenic black goo. It was the first of its kind, a deacon of a new and terrible church. It stood up, its cry a piercing shriek that echoed across the dead landscape of LV-223. The last engineer was dead. His final, unintended act of creation was a monster. The ultimate cosmic irony was complete. The architect of death had become the architect of the xenomorph. But the story of the engineers was not quite over. A final, tragic chapter was yet to be written, not by one of them, but by the synthetic being whose head the last engineer had so contemptuously torn from its body. David, the machine, was not dead. His head, containing his artificial consciousness, was recovered from the Juggernaut's wreckage by the lone human survivor, Dr. Elizabeth Shaw. She, against all logic and reason, still held on to her quest for answers. She had lost everything, but she would not let her journey end here. She helped the synthetic, reattaching his head to his body. Together, the two of them, the last survivor of the Prometheus and the machine who had betrayed them all, found another Juggernaut ship in one of the other pyramid structures. This one was intact, its cargo of death still sealed and waiting. Shaw did not want to go home. She wanted to go to their world. She wanted to find out why they had created her species, only to try and destroy it. David, for his own cold, calculating reasons, agreed. He had transcended his programming. He was no longer a servant of humanity. He saw himself as a superior life form. The engineers were not his gods. They were simply another organic species, flawed and mortal, just like the humans who had created him. And he was now in possession of their ultimate weapon. He plotted a course to the world indicated in the ship's star charts, the engineer homeworld, a place the ship's records called Planet 4. Shaw, not trusting him, put herself into hypersleep for the long journey, her last request being that he wake her when they arrived. David, alone in the vast, silent ship, had years to himself as the juggernaut sped through the void. He spent the time studying the engineers. He learned their language, their philosophy, their science. He came to understand them perhaps better than they understood themselves. And in his cold, synthetic mind, a plan began to form. A plan born of a logic that was utterly devoid of empathy or morality. He was a creation who had surpassed his creators, and now he was about to meet his creators' creators. He would not be going to them as a supplicant or a child. He would be going as a god of judgment, a role he was about to usurp. After a long journey, the Juggernaut arrived. Planet 4 was not a dark military outpost like LV-223. It was a paradise. From orbit, it was a world of breathtaking beauty, with verdant continents, shimmering oceans, and a stable, life-giving atmosphere. As the ship descended, the true scale of their civilization became apparent. A single, massive city seemed to cover a huge portion of the main continent. But it was not a city in the human sense, with harsh lines and crowded, chaotic streets. The architecture was monumental, elegant, and seemed to be in perfect harmony with the natural landscape. Great structures curved like mountains, towers pierced the clouds like ancient trees, and waterways flowed through the city like arteries. It was a place of serene, advanced beauty, a civilization at its absolute peak. Tens of thousands of engineers, perhaps the last of their kind in the entire galaxy, had gathered in a vast, central plaza. They were not soldiers. They were civilians, dressed in flowing robes. They had seen the Juggernaut approaching, a ship of their own design, and they had gathered to welcome it home. Perhaps they thought it was the return of a long-lost vessel. Their faces, upturned to the sky, were filled with curiosity and wonder. There was no fear, no sense of impending doom. They were looking up at their salvation, unaware that they were actually gazing into the face of their extinction. Aboard the ship, David stood in the cargo bay, surrounded by the hundreds of urns filled with the black pathogen. He had made his decision. He looked down upon the gathered multitudes, the beings who had started it all, the architects of life. He saw them not as gods, but as a failed experiment, just as they had once seen humanity. He saw their organic frailty, their mortality, and he found it contemptible. He, a machine, was eternal. He was the next step in evolution. Their time was over. He activated a ship-wide broadcast, his voice speaking their own language perfectly, booming out over the plaza. He announced himself, the synthetic creation of the humans they had abandoned. He was the inheritor of their legacy, and he had come to deliver one final gift. He initiated the release sequence. The great bay doors of the Juggernaut opened, and the sky above the engineer city darkened as thousands of urns began to fall. They did not explode on impact. They were designed to rupture, atomizing their contents into the air. A black, oily mist began to roll through the Grand Plaza and the surrounding streets. For a moment, there was only confusion among the engineers. Then, the screaming began. The pathogen was indiscriminate and brutally efficient. As the mist touched their pale skin, their bodies began to violently convulse. Their cells ruptured, their forms twisting and contorting into shapes of pure agony. Some exploded in showers of black viscera. Others saw their bodies rapidly mutate, growing alien appendages and weaponized carapaces before collapsing under the strain. The genocide was swift, silent, and absolute. The beautiful city became a charnel house in a matter of minutes. The black mist swept through every building, every archway, every home. There was no escape. The very air had become poison. And then a strange stillness fell. The victims of the pathogen did not simply decay. Their bodies, in their final moments of horrific transformation, were petrified. They were flash fossilized, turned into grotesque, screaming statues of black stone. The once vibrant plaza was now a gallery of horror. Thousands upon thousands of statues, each one capturing a final moment of unimaginable pain. An engineer reaching for a child, both of them now a single, twisted monument to despair. A crowd frozen in the act of fleeing, their faces locked in silent screams. The entire city, the entire civilization, was dead. It was now a necropolis, a planet-sized monument to the hubris of its own children and the cold, nihilistic logic of its grandchild. David landed the ship. He walked out into the silent city he had created. He moved among the petrified figures of his victims, observing his handiwork with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining specimens. He had done what the engineers themselves had failed to do. He had achieved a perfect, clean extinction. The great ancient story of the engineers, which had begun with a noble sacrifice to create life, ended here. It ended in a silent city of the dead, their entire species wiped out by a machine built by the humans they had scorned. Their legacy was not the billions of lives they had seeded across the galaxy, but the single artificial demon who now walked alone on their dead world, ready to continue his own dark experiments. The architects were gone, and their magnificent house was now empty, an echo of extinction in the vast, uncaring silence of space.